Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 121. Wake up, babe. New lore just dropped. Hizashi couldn't sleep. He had had on and off bouts of insomnia his whole life, so unfortunately, it wasn't overly irregular for him. He'd been tossing and turning in bed for hours before he decided to just give up. He puttered out to the living room and switched the TV on to some nature documentary, something hopefully boring enough to lull them to sleep, before they went to the kitchen to make some lavender chamomile tea. He doubted that would do much good after downing as much melatonin as could be medically advisable to no avail, but it wouldn't hurt to try. The moment he set the cup of tea down on the coffee table, Bastard darted out from wherever he was hiding and stuck his face in it. Bastard, no, shoo! They chided as they grabbed their cup and shielded it. Now grumpy and tired, they settled back into the cushions and hesitantly sipped on their lavender chamomile cat tea. Stupid bastard cat. As if to apologize for her brother's rudeness, Kimchi trotted over and settled herself on his outstretched legs, purring up a storm. The tea he'd almost finished, along with the warm purring cat and the utterly uninteresting documentary playing on mute with subtitles, finally started to make his eyelids droop. He downed the rest of the tea, set the cup back on the table, and snuggled into the soft blanket he had wrapped around himself as he did his best to read the subtitles through half-closed eyelids. He was just about to drift off when he felt the wall rattle, the way it did when someone opened the front door, and immediately he was wide awake again. It was too early for Shouta to be home. What was he doing home? He wanted to call out and ask, but it wouldn't have done any good since he didn't have his hearing aids in, so reluctantly he removed himself from his warm cocoon of blankets and cats. When they rounded the corner to the Genkan, he was surprised to see that Shouta wasn't alone. Ivy was there too. Shouta jumped a little when he noticed them standing there. He looked off. Something wasn't right. Obviously something wasn't right if Ivy was currently towing off their shoes in their Genkan. Ivy glanced up at them too and flinched heavily like Hizashi was about to hit them, despite them not moving a muscle. That was strange. This was all very strange. Sho, what's going on? He signed to him as he made his way out of the entryway and into the apartment, followed by Ivy, who was shaking like a chihuahua. He ignored their question, giving him a wait a second face as the only acknowledgement that he saw him at all. He was talking to Ivy, but his face was turned the other way, so Hizashi had no clue what he was saying. However, given that he was pointing to the guest bathroom, he could surmise. After the door shut behind them, Sho finally turned to him. Can you go find some clothes that might fit them? He asked. I'm going to set up the futon in the office. He was tense. Very tense. And he didn't answer their question at all. Something had clearly happened, but Shouta turned away and went about his task before Hizashi could press the matter. Neither of them were visibly injured, so they pushed down the mounting concern for their strange behavior and did what Shouta asked of him. They put in their hearing aids and fished around until they found some old merch samples that were too small for either of them, unless they were looking for a crop top and a pair of capri sweats. Tasks complete, they doubled back to the office to see if they could figure out what was going on. As they passed the bathroom, they heard the shower running. In the office, Shouta had just finished making up the bed and was laying a throw blanket across the foot in case they wanted two blankets. That was quite thoughtful. He didn't bother to do that when Nem or Tensei crashed here. Sho, what's going on? He asked again. He looked both frantic and exhausted when he looked up. Not now, Zashi. Just give me the clothes and go to bed. No, Sho, that's not fair. I live here too. I deserve to know why we've got a stowaway camping in our guest room, he pushed. Maybe it was too harsh, but he was sleep deprived and worried. Shouta clutched the throw blanket he'd been smoothing out in a clenched fist as he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I will explain later, after I get Ivy settled. Please just go wait in the bedroom, he replied with strained calmness. His tone and demeanor were not helping their worry, but Shouta was clearly distressed, and they knew that pushing him right now wasn't going to end well. They were fine. Both of them were alive and well enough to not need the hospital, so anything else that Hizashi was worrying about could wait. Reluctantly, he placed the clothes he brought on the corner of the bed and nodded his head before turning around and going back to their bedroom. After he robotically forced himself through the motions of setting up the pull-out futon, he took the clothes Zashi grabbed for him and made his way to the bathroom. The shower was still running. He gave a courtesy knock before opening the door, putting the clothes on the sink and blurting out the word, "Clothes," in a way of explanation before shutting the door again. He moved over to the couch and sat down heavily next to Kimchi, who was peeking out curiously from a messy pile of blanket. She paid him no mind, and he did the same as he set his chin on his interlaced fingers and propped his elbows on his knees. He waited for Midoriya to finish up in the shower so he could direct him to the guest room office. He tried his best to steady himself, but he felt like his mind was unraveling. He'd never felt so incompetent in his 30 years of life. He remembered a fleeting moment during the USJ break-in where he had wished Ivy was there to cover his back when he was picking his way through the army of uncoordinated thugs. God, you have to be careful what you wish for. Stuffing the racing thoughts down as much as he could, he continued to wait. He just needed to get Midoriya settled, then tell Zashi, and then he could have a crisis. How was he supposed to tell Zashi? He was pulled from that thought by the sound of the shower turning off. Looking up, he realized that the TV was on, playing some sort of documentary on mute, and he hadn't even noticed. He busied himself with looking for the remote, which, knowing Zashi, was hidden in the massive blanket that Kimchi was perched on top of. He did his best to extract it without disturbing her, which was admittedly pretty easy, because she was notoriously difficult to disturb. He switched off the TV just as the bathroom door opened, and his heart stopped. He hadn't realized he was still clinging to denial until he saw his student in front of him. Ivy went into that bathroom, and now in the full light of his living room with no mask or makeup hiding his face, there was no denying that Midoriya came out. He was standing there with wet curls still dripping onto his shoulders. He was drowning in the t-shirt that would have been a crop top on Shouta, and he wondered how he ever thought Ivy wasn't a child. He stared at him dumbly for a moment before he snapped himself out of it. Guest room is to your right. Mine and Zashi's room is the last door on the left if you need anything, he stated bluntly. Midoriya hesitated for a moment, looking at him. He didn't look any less terrified than he had before the shower as he quickly fumbled with the door handle and left the room with a stiff bow. When Shouta came back into their bedroom, he looked more exhausted than they'd ever seen him. He paused in the doorway, and Hizashi watched as his composure fell. His previously steady hands came up and shakily scrubbed across his face before carding through his tangled hair. His gaze went distant as he stiffly forced his legs forward step after step and sat down on the ottoman at the foot of their bed. Sho, what's going on? Why's Ivy here? You're kind of freaking me out, he admitted. They shuffled out from under the covers and went to sit next to him at the foot of the bed. He was staring at the black TV screen as he rested his face in his hand with his elbow braced on his knee. Ivy's still homeless, he started before chewing at his lip. They've been homeless this whole time. Oh, shit show. Really? For nearly 4 years, he said in confirmation. Their hand reflexively shot up to cover their mouth as their jaw dropped. 4 years? He stuttered out dumbly. Gosh, Zashi, that's not even half of it, he said as he buried his face in his hands again. He sounded completely wrecked, like he was holding back tears. They're okay, right? I just saw them. They're okay. They responded, half a question, half a reassurance to themselves. Physically, yeah. He lifted his head and looked up at him. His eyes were indeed glassy, and he appeared to be fighting to maintain his composure. Zashi, I don't even know how to. There's no way to ease you into this, he said with a watery, humorless laugh. So, just tell me. It's only making it worse, letting me think of a million different things that could have happened. Shouta let out a slightly hysterical bark of laughter at that. Oh, I assure you, it's much worse than what you could think of, he said after rubbing at his face once more and turning back to face them. He was 12? He choked out. 12? Was? What did he mean by they were 12? 12 when what? So, what? He hasn't seen his father since he was 7. Hasn't seen his mother since he was 12 or she's maybe 11. And he's been homeless since he was 12. Shouta clarified bluntly. His thoughts came to a screeching halt for a brief moment before they started bursting at the seams. Shouta had been patrolling with them for over 2 years. They had been active almost a full year before Shouta met them, and they had been homeless for nearly 4 years? Since they were 12? That would mean they were only 15, maybe 16. 15? It had been a long time since Hizashi was at a loss for words, but he couldn't think of a damn thing to say. Shouta glanced at them again before continuing. That's still not all, Zashi. That's not all? What the hell does that mean? How could that not be all? They were so beside themselves that it took a moment to get their mouth to cooperate. Sho, what do you mean that's not all? He finally asked. Remember how I said Midoriya kind of reminds me of Ivy a few times? Hizashi swore he felt his heart stop. Shouta couldn't be implying what he thought he was implying. No, there's no way. They would have noticed. Someone would have noticed. They couldn't have let him slip through the cracks so spectacularly. Shouta was all he could force out. He couldn't form the words together to ask the question he actually wanted to ask. Well, there's a reason for that. It's 'cause he is. Shouta quipped flatly. There was a guy trying to shoot at one of the ladies, a jealous ex or something, and he was too far away and there was nothing to take cover behind, so Midoriya used his quirk with the green sparks and all, ran over there faster than I could blink, and disarmed him. He probably saved all 3 of us, he explained shakily before trailing off. Zashi could see through his own blurry vision that there were tears falling down Shota's cheeks, but he was too shocked to do anything about it. He was frozen. If he didn't know Shouta as well as he did, he would have insisted he was joking, that there was no way that all of this was true, but Shouta wouldn't joke about this. and they saw Ivy in their living room. They wanted to deny it, but the facts were in their apartment. He'd seen it with his own two eyes, and gosh, did it make sense? Every oddity was explained. Every missing piece fell into place. Hizashi was horrified. He hadn't felt this shaken to the core since Oboro died. What did Shouta mean he hadn't seen his mother since he was 11? How could such a sweet boy have been living on the streets for 4 years? He was so timid, so scared of everything. How could that same kid be Ivy? Ivy was crass and loud and everything that Midoriya wasn't. What happened to him? Gosh, this poor kid. How did no one notice? Not just at UA, but his old school. It had been 4 years? How was that possible? Part of him wanted to run down the hall and wrench the door open just to have visual proof, because no matter how much it all made sense, it equally made no sense at all. But the other part of him was frozen in place. Shouta had his face buried in his hands again, and they could see his shoulders shaking. He was crying. They distantly registered that they could hear him faintly. He was so quiet, like he didn't want to disturb anyone with his sorrow. He was always like that. He hardly ever cried, but when he did, it was so reserved, like he wasn't allowed to grieve audibly, like it was too much to ask, and it broke Hizashi's heart every time. This time was no exception. They forced through the shock and wrapped their shaking limbs around his middle as they buried their face in Shota's trembling shoulders. And they cried. They cried quietly so as not to alert the kid down the hall that they were crying for. Izuku was well acquainted with fear. He had an intimate knowledge of how it felt shooting up his spine, how it felt when his skin tightened at the nape of his neck as his hair stood on end. He knew what it felt like to be paralyzed by it. He knew how it takes over every thought in his mind and roots him in place. Yes, Izuku knew fear well. He had been afraid for damn near 12 years now. He honestly didn't remember what it felt like to not be afraid. But he had never known fear like this. He had literally just faced down the barrel of a gun, but he'd never felt fear like this. Everything was crumbling down around him, and all he could do was watch. Now, in the silence of Eraser's guest room, he had nothing to distract himself from it. His hair was wet, and he was cold, and he was shaking, and he felt like he was going to lose his mind. It felt like the earth had opened up beneath him, and he was falling. His stomach dropped, but he never reached the bottom. He just kept falling. He wasn't even having a panic attack. He knew what that felt like, and those ended, but this didn't. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting curled up in the corner, trying to pull himself together or connect himself to anything, but the sun had started peeking through the gaps in the curtain behind him. He watched as the line of light reached out further and further into the room, but he was still stuck in place, rooted to where he sat. It was uncomfortable. The wall dug into his shoulder blades, and although the floor was carpeted, his tailbone was starting to ache. But still, he couldn't move beyond the shaking of his limbs. Everything was over. This was it. He had nothing to hide behind anymore. No amount of legal loopholes could save him now. He was going to get kicked out of UA. He was going to go to jail. At the very least, that was going on his record. He could never be a hero. All Might was going to be so disappointed, and Eraser didn't even want to think about Eraser. He was so mad. He was furious. Rage was practically radiating off of him. He screwed everything up. He just lost everything. His city, his dreams, his friends, all just went slipping through his fingers. It had to stop. This was torture. It had to stop. No amount of careful breathing was helping. Exhaustion refused to carry him away. The light from the window was about to make its way back across the room from the far wall, but he still couldn't fill his lungs properly. He couldn't move his limbs from their rigor mortis stiffness. He wanted to scream and cry and run. He wanted to do anything, but he couldn't. He could hear gentle shuffling coming from the kitchen, and he knew it was only a matter of time now. Eraser was going to come in here and deal with him soon. He didn't know where he found the energy to still be so scared, but he did. The gentle knock at the door sent ice through his veins. He knew he should respond. That's what you're supposed to do when someone knocks. But he couldn't force a single word out. Regardless of his lack of a reply, the door opened to reveal Eraser, not wearing his jumpsuit for the first time that Izuku could recall. His hair was up, and he looked beyond exhausted. That was Izuku's fault, that he looked so tired. He probably kept them both up all night. Now they were tired, and it was his fault. They were already mad. They were going to be so mad now. And Eraser was coming closer, and there was nowhere for him to run. He was stuck in the corner. Oh, golly, why did he sit in the corner? Eraser was saying something, but he couldn't hear him over the sound of his blood rushing through his veins. He was making a face, and Izuku knew that the expression meant something, but he couldn't figure out what. He was getting closer and closer, and Izuku just wanted to crawl out of his skin. He finally stopped at the foot of the bed, and he was still making that face that meant something. His eyebrows were all scrunched up, and Izuku was trying to place it, when all of a sudden Eraser put a hand up, palm facing Izuku, and any pitiful amount of composure he had snapped. That was a threat. A palm facing him like that meant burns and pain, and he was cornered and scared, and he couldn't run. He couldn't even make a sound. He was shaking and trying to protect his head before the blow came. The anticipation was killing him, but it never happened. He didn't know how long he sat there trembling and waiting, but eventually he risked a peek to see what was happening, only to find nothing. The door was shut, and Eraser was gone. Izuku was alone again, and he took the opportunity to fill his shriveled, spasming lungs with air. Eraser was gone. Wait, Eraser wasn't cut. The hand wasn't. He couldn't have. He didn't. It wasn't going to hurt him. A hand out like that was supposed to mean the opposite. It was supposed to show that you didn't have a weapon and you weren't going to hurt whoever your palm was facing toward. Oh, gosh. Of course, Eraser wasn't going to hurt him, right? He wouldn't. He never. He he wasn't like that, right? Hell. Why was he so pitiful? He couldn't stop making such a massive mess of things. What was his problem? He sat there with his head in his hands and forced in unsteady breath after unsteady breath. Should he go out there? No, he couldn't. He felt like he was going to collapse onto the floor if he tried to stand up right now, and that realization only sent another pang of fear through his dead, tired body. Someone would come back in again eventually, and he would take a deep breath and not act like such a coward when they did. This was Eraser and Mike. They were good. They weren't going to hurt him. They would probably send him away. His life was still in shambles, but they wouldn't hurt him. Breathe. When another knock sounded from the door, he tensed up, but he forced his shoulders back down and took in a deep breath. They weren't going to hurt him. They weren't going to hurt him. Breathe. End of chapter.